In the last two presentations, I've been talking about and trying to build on the idea of the Synoptic Gospels, and I've thrown out a number of different ideas about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I hope it is clear now that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot in common. More than 50% of what you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke will always be something that you can find somewhere else. In some cases, or in one case in particular, in Mark's Gospel, 90% or more of his Gospel overlaps what we find in the others. And so that leads scholars to the conclusion, and I think it's a good conclusion, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot in common. So there's some common source or reason why they have so much in common. Now, a simple explanation would be, well, they're all three describing the life of Jesus, and so there's overlap. That would be a little simplistic, though. I think that's true. I think they're all three describing the life of Jesus, and that's where ultimately these traditions come from. These stories about Jesus, these teachings about Jesus, ultimately come from Jesus. But they come through the early Christian community preaching about Jesus and sharing the story of Jesus. And so what happened was, I think, is that that story of Jesus took on some standardized form. And that's the outline that's reflected in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. People told the story of Jesus, or often told the story of Jesus, in a certain structure, in a certain outline. That outline, as we find it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, basically goes like this. Of course, the birth of Jesus is very significant, but Mark doesn't talk about that. He begins the story of Jesus with his baptism by John. So Jesus is baptized by John. He then is tempted by the devil in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. So that's the opening scene in Mark's Gospel. Jesus' baptism and then his being tempted by Satan in the desert. After that, Jesus returns to Galilee, where he grew up. Galilee is the northern area, northern territory in the ancient land of Israel. Today it's still called Galilee. The center of it is the Sea of Galilee, a large lake there, or a relatively large lake, certainly for that part of the world, a large freshwater lake. And around there, many cities had grown up. There are many hills there, sort of mountain range that runs through the center of the land going down to Jerusalem. It's maybe, I don't know, 80, 90 miles or so, 70, 80 miles, getting from, say, Jerusalem up to the Sea of Galilee. If you look at a map, you'll see that Nazareth, the town that Jesus grew up in, is a little bit south of the Sea of Galilee, not very far. Jesus, during much of his public ministry, according to the Gospels, he went around the cities of Galilee. He would preach to these various communities and towns and so on. So many of the places that you see referenced in the New Testament, many of the towns, like Cana of Galilee, for example, in John's Gospel, or Tiberias, or Capernaum, Nazareth. All of these are towns or cities around the Sea of Galilee. So in the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the story begins, at least in the case of Mark's Gospel, with Jesus as being baptized and being tempted by the devil in the south. So he goes down where John was preaching and baptizing people. He goes down to John at the sort of southern end of the Jordan River that flows down from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea that's down south of Jerusalem. And so Jesus goes down there to be baptized and to go out into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, all of which, by the way, is highly symbolic and significant. He then returns to Galilee and he begins a public ministry where he goes around and preaches and teaches and performs miracles in the various towns around Galilee. And he does so for about 3 years, give or take a little bit of time. For about 3 years, he goes around Galilee, and then he's determined with his disciples or apostles. By the way, the word disciple is just a broader word than apostle. It has to do with someone who's a student of a teacher. They're a follower of a teacher. Not in the sense of going to class and just listening to someone, but they identify themselves with that person as a master, as a teacher, as someone they believe can guide them into the truth of things. And so they follow Jesus to Jerusalem. So that's the third motion or movement in the Gospels. The first is being baptized by John and being tempted by the devil. And then he goes to Galilee, and there he begins this several-year ministry where he goes around preaching, teaching, and performing miracles. Then at the end of that period of time, he is determined to go to Jerusalem. Now, this going to Jerusalem is not just any going to Jerusalem. It's presented as a fateful one. It is a sort of the climactic moment of the life of Jesus. He is going up there to do something. Well, when he gets to Jerusalem, there's a short period of ministry and teaching and a few miracles and so on. But for various reasons, and we'll talk about perhaps in later presentations, Jesus is taken, he is betrayed by one of his own, by Judas, and he is crucified after a short trial, two trials actually, one before the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling body of Jews, 70 Jews with the high priest, and then he was sent over to the Roman authority, Pontius Pilate, and there he is ultimately condemned to death and crucified. He's placed in a nearby tomb, and then according to the Gospels, he rises from the dead on the third day after that. So, and that's the basic story of the Synoptic Gospels, at least the major motions in it. So first we see him with John the Baptist and his temptations, then we see him around Galilee, and that's really the bulk of the Gospels. At least a lot of the Synoptic Gospels is focused on that Galilean ministry, and then it tells us what happens when he goes up to Jerusalem. Again, a highly symbolic and significant movement to Jerusalem, and what happens there culminating in his death, burial, and resurrection. So that's the story of the Synoptic Gospels in a nutshell. In the case of John's Gospel, he doesn't focus on that sort of outline at all. What he does is he builds his Gospel around 3 visits of Jesus to Jerusalem, 3 annual trips of Jesus to Jerusalem, and then finally, of course, an extended period of time of what happens at the end of the ministry of Jesus, the last moments with his disciples or apostles, and then his trial, death, burial, and resurrection. So the Gospels, they're obviously telling the same story, they're obviously talking about the same person, but they have a different structure, a different outline between the Synoptic Gospels and John's Gospel. So that's the essential content. Now, having said that, though, doesn't give you the details of it. It certainly doesn't give us the meaning of all of these events, but at least it gives to us the general skeleton in which these Gospels are built. In Matthew and Luke, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of focus on what Jesus teaches. In Mark's Gospel, there is not. Mark is more a Gospel inviting us to look at Jesus doing things and to try to understand who he is based on observing him in action. In the other Gospels, there's a lot more invitation to think about Jesus as teacher, as one who guides us and gives us insight and wisdom. But all of that, of course, is in service to the ultimate act of Jesus giving himself in love for his people and rising again from the dead. So these culminating events, these decisive final events, give to us a perspective on all of the life of Jesus that profoundly affects the way we interpret it. So the next question that would arise in our minds, and I want to address another before going into some specific details of the life of Jesus, I'd like to sample or to address 2 questions about the Gospels, and I'll do them in subsequent presentations. But the 2 things that I'm interested in maybe thinking a little bit about are, number one, I'd like us to think a little bit about what confidence do we have in the story of Jesus as told in the Gospels? Where does our confidence from a historical perspective come from? And so what I'd like to do is develop one argument. We could present many different arguments, but I'd like to present one argument very briefly to you in support of the historical reliability of the transmission of the story of Jesus in the Gospels. And then secondly, I'd like us to just sample one of the teachings of Jesus as a way of getting into the broader message of Christ. I'd like us to look at Jesus' first words in the Sermon on the Mount that's found in Matthew chapter 5, where he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So in the next 2 presentations, hopefully briefly, I'll talk about those 2 issues of the reliability and trustworthiness of the Gospels, and then secondly, just try to get into Jesus' message by looking at that line, "Blessed are the poor in spirit."